grass-fed meat, but all they're doing is the animals are still trapped and they're just dumping grass in the cow's head, and it's not out there eating real grass in the pasture.
Many farmers are growing both conventional and organically because they have to, right? It's a huge burden for farmers to make the commitment on their own. Many people may not realize this, but to go from conventional farming to organic farming, there's a 3-year transition period. And so farmers have to make the decision and then make the investment to shift for 3 years.
Ricky, thank you so much for joining us today on the Extend podcast. Been excited to have you to get a true inside the industry perspective on our food system. So thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So I think it's great for our audience to hear a little bit about kind of your journey and how you got this inside perspective into the food industry. I mean, you're the CEO, right, of Daily Harvest.
Every farmer I've ever talked to in my role at Daily Harvest takes the responsibility of feeding the country incredibly seriously. I have never met a farmer that wants to use chemical pesticides or chemical fertilizers, right? They want stability. They want to know they can do good. They would love nothing more than to get the support of, again, corporations and government to help them move towards a more organic and regenerative system. That's completely lost in the dialogue. And so we try to do our part to bring those stories to life, because I think the more people feel connected to not just where their food is grown, but who is growing it, you humanize the system more. And then you start to realize that, you know, we're not just changing this because the way I want to eat or the way I need to eat. We're also changing it on behalf of the people growing our food.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about what you just mentioned, the organic and regenerative farming movement that's happening more now. Right now, I think there is a definite mind share of people to look for organic food, but there's also a lot of concerns there. There's a concern about cost. There's a concern about, is this really organic, or am I being duped? You know, there's videos on Instagram that you see for, grass-fed meat, but all they're doing is the animals are still trapped and they're just dumping grass in the cow's head, and it's not out there eating real grass in the pasture. And so there's, a little bit of mistrust of the industry as well, really trying to solve these problems versus just kind of covering it up and just marketing what we want to hear.
Yeah.
And how do you get people to think about that?
Yeah, well, I'll say, of all the certifications and sort of movements that are out there, the organic movement has done an incredible job of building in the rigor and the sort of responsibility on sort of trust but verify. Right. In my experience in the food industry, it's top of the top.
Great.
I think you also see the organic movement advocating for more oversight, which I think is a great sign, right? In the last administration, there was, increasing investment and actually having more oversight, right? More verification. And that's coming from inside, right? That's, to me, is just a wonderful sign of why the organic movement has always been so strong. I think what often gets in the way of advancing the organic volume and the organic commitment, you mentioned price, right? There is a supply and demand reality, right? If we could grow more organic commodities, prices would be able to come down. It's a huge burden for farmers to make the commitment on their own. Many people may not realize this, but to go from conventional farming to organic farming, there's a 3-year transition period. Oh, wow. And so farmers have to make the decision and then make the investment to shift for 3 years. They're growing organically, and yet they're not allowed to be certified organic. And so we've been actually working with both farmers and some other entities to try to help accelerate the adoption of that transition, take some of the risk off the table. Maybe in some cases we've done some direct contracting where we've actually paid a premium for the product in that period so that they feel like they can make the decision on their own and investment on their own. In other cases, we've supported grant funding. And again, the last administration, I think it was new $500 million invested in organic transition. Going from 1% of farmland grown organically to 10% would be a massive deal, but again, would require real collaboration and commitment. Sure. And then the last thing I'll say on this, but again goes, I try to give people a little bit of picture of what's going on behind the scenes. This idea that, there's conventional farmers and there's organic farmers is also a bit misleading. Many farmers are growing both conventional and organically because they have to, right? They're supporting the market as it is. And in the case of organic, right, we need more investment in getting ahead of the risks of pests that emerge. We've had a number of conversations with Montana lentil farmers, one of the most unique and incredible communities I've ever interacted with. And they talked about how they were really trying to come together, even though some of them compete even, to try to encourage University of Montana and through government funding to be investing in new emerging threats. What are the solutions that they can deploy organically? Because they could see in, 3-5 years, I might have to go right back to growing conventional lentils because something new is going to emerge that I can't solve for with the organic tools I have today. So again, North Star needs to be a commitment to organic. North Star has to be a recognition that you never stop having to solve this problem. It's an always-on challenge. But it's a challenge I deeply believe in. It should not come down to a financial choice for people, whether or not they should be able to eat pesticide-free. I think that's a failure of the system as it operates today.
Right. And then what about the regenerative movement? Talk a little bit about where that movement is. Well, first, let's define regenerative agriculture, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So regenerative is a word that's being used quite a bit in lots of different places. And it is still, I would say, not ill-defined, but can be used to mean a lot of different things. There's work being done. Actually, California is working on a certification that would sort of standardize what regenerative means. But generally speaking, it means an adoption of practices on the land, or in the case of farms that are raising animals, right? Increasing the animal welfare quality, increasing the type of, quite frankly, support of the people growing the food, and then ultimately a treatment of the soil that the food is being grown in. Adopting practices that give back to the soil, that remove some of the hard practices of stripping away. And you mentioned where the system was before the industrialization of it. It looks a lot like it did 100 years ago.
Right.
And so the sort of usage of the word regenerative is new, but the tools are not.
Right.
And so I think the reason why that's becoming a much larger portion of the dialogue right now and a greater place of focus is because I think there are lots of people that are recognizing that, one of the best ways to address the climate crisis is to leverage this incredible carbon sequestration capability of soil, but we can't do that by farming the way we have. Right. And so that's part of the reason regenerative has become quite popular and important. But the other, I think, is like a little bit more of a realization that if we don't start treating the soil like a living, breathing organism, there might not be soil that food can be grown in 20 years. Right. And so I think the intersection of these conversations, regenerative and organic, is key. Our philosophy, and I want to be very clear, this is sort of not necessarily the industry as a whole, but mine and Daily Harvest, is that organic has to be a foundation for regenerative. Yes, deploying more regenerative practices unilaterally is great, but if we're still deploying chemical pesticides and fertilizer, we're missing the plot.
Right.
And so we focus a lot on that intersection.
Got it. So is a regenerative farm by necessity also organic or not
Today,
necessarily?
no. It doesn't have to be. There is a really interesting certification emerging called ROC, Regenerative Organic Certification. And so they are taking the lead on actually saying, if you buy regenerative organic certified product, it is organic plus, if you will. The open question, I think, that we, and I say this as a consumer and as a leader in the industry, is, will that then command a net new premium? How do we start to see the stratification of pricing? And if ultimately food that is regeneratively organic certified is even further away from, the vast majority of people being able to afford it, how will we get those practices deployed in a much more wide stream way? And I think that's where it goes back to what are we subsidizing and what are we focusing on?
Yeah. So right now, the current status of farming subsidies, the subsidies are still going to mass production farms, right? And that's why you see less and less of these smaller farms, or they're getting gobbled up or they just can't make any money and they close down.
A lot of the issue is that farmers have sort of an annual decision to make in many cases. And many farmers lease land. Many farmers are being faced with the question of, do I take another year of this risk or do I sell it off to a developer? We partner with an incredible organization called the American Farmland Trust. Their mission is to preserve farmland in the hands of farmers. And so their big focus is on how do we make sure the farming community remains viable, remains in control of their land, and isn't, faced with this decision of, is this just an unfortunately easy way out, right? Given how much development is happening. We built a multi-year partnership between them and an incredible certifying body called CCOF that we actually combined forces and created a multi-year grant funding and wraparound services for small, underrepresented farmers that we got them to make sure they had the tools they needed to keep their land, to grow organically, and to get to that 3-year process. And so it was a really special project. We're actually on winding down year 3 of it. We look to figure out, how do we expand this? How do we maybe adopt and inspire others to do more of the same? But it's a big challenge. How do we keep farmland as farmland?
Yeah. And speaking towards, regenerative farming is making sure the soil is healthy, but also there's a component to regenerative farming about animal welfare, right? And so let's talk about animal farming and raising farm animals just in general. What kind of transpired there from, this massive, even just a few hours away from here, not too far from here, there's massive cattle farms where the cattle are kept in very, very tight spaces and not allowed to move too much. And they're fed all sorts of, grain with glyphosate, et cetera. And so the quality of that meat is actually more inflammatory to our system as humans, because whatever we eat is coming from the animals and what they eat. And so how do we get to this place with animal farming, and how do we unwind this?
I think it's very similar to where we got in the more sort of packaged and processed goods side, where, we prioritized the highest calorie output for the cheapest price. When you think about the sort of the advent of fast food and sort of the convenience space, and you think about literally how cheap it is to go get, a cheeseburger versus, what it costs to get, a couple apples at your farmer's market. I think that is pretty simple explanation.
Very simple, yeah.
I think this is one where, you've seen a lot of development of sort of alternative meats, right? That are, that space is trying to, hey, let's give people what they expect and what they crave, but done in an alternative way. That's sort of one approach to try to unwind some of the, mass consumption of the quality of meat we have today. The other is, how do we start to shift away consumer behavior, right? How do we shift away what people crave, what people love? This is an area where I don't have all the answers.
No.
Not that I have all the answers everywhere, but my point is, like, when I think about it as a consumer, I think about, how do we get people to start to see the benefit of eating alternative fast food, if you will, and that sort of intensity of the sensorial experience that we've generated is one I don't know how we're going to unwind. No. So maybe you have some answers on this one, but I really wrestle with it. And as you know, like I said, as a consumer, to your point, you walk into a store, whether it's eggs or chicken or meat, and you think you're making the right choice. Oh, I'm buying, pasture raised, or I'm buying grass fed, or I'm buying, even organic chicken, where you're like, and as someone who's deep in the space, I question myself.
Right.
And so I don't know what the long-term answer to unwind that part of the system is, because it feels so embedded. And ironically, you would think, given all the frustration and outrage about sort of animal welfare challenges, that this would have been something that we would have seen acceleration and overhauling sooner. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe we just need to continue to shine a light on it. As I said earlier, when people get frustrated and angry, things tend to change.
I agree. I don't have an answer either, but I do know some people in the industry. And unfortunately, right now, if you're going to have a steak that is truly pasture raised and allowed and grass fed in the pasture, it's a very expensive steak.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think there needs to be some shifting of how we subsidize what type of food we're subsidizing, for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's going to need to happen.
I remember when I was sort of emerging in this space, a book, I can't remember exactly when it came out, but Dan Barber's Third Plate was one of the first books I read in this space. And I remember just that sort of early prompt that he raised around this idea of what does it look like when sort of meat becomes more the sort of accoutrement to the plate, if you will. And, I remember, I can't remember exactly the dish he was describing, but, it was more of like a carrot steak with a meat sauce versus a big steak, and I think chefs need to play a big role in helping us imagine an alternative, delicious way of eating. Yeah. But I think in the case of what you're describing with meat, the only answer is for it to be less a portion of what we're consuming, right? The only way to flip the script and make the quality and pricing work is, I think, to get there. And again, that I wish I had the answers for, because it seems like we're so far away from it. And I think, there's been a lot of skepticism of late of this sort of alternative meat space. And yet every year there's 10, 12 new products that are coming to market. And so that doesn't seem to be shifting sort of the percentage of meat consumption, away either. So I don't know. This is a tough one.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk in the health and wellness space about the importance of protein. And
yeah.
Even though you can get protein very effectively from a plant-based diet as well, I think that has also made a lot of people really consider putting meat back into their diet.
Right, tacking back towards a meat-heavy, makes sense.
And I think part of the problem was also a problem with our plants not being as nutrient-dense.
Yeah.
I think also there's a problem with plants being low nutrient density, but also there's less fiber consumption and all these problems, and they're more inflammatory. And so when people get an inflammatory reaction from the plants that they're eating, then they naturally shift to eliminating some of the plants and more towards meat.
Well, you bring up the fiber point, and I just want to raise, oftentimes we equate what we're looking for as protein when we're really looking for satiety.
Right.
And the value of fiber and the value of eating more plants, ideally organic if you can, is that you're getting those sort of key nutrients and that fiber that ultimately are the things that are going to keep you, energetic throughout the day, keep you feeling full. But again, as an industry, we've sort of helped synonymize protein with satiety, and it's not the only thing that's necessary.
Exactly. Let's dive into a little bit on gluten as well. I know you have a lot of gluten-free products.
All gluten-free, yeah.
Yeah. Can you kind of give us a little story on gluten and how it became a net negative in our food system?
Well, I think this is a fascinating area where I still think the science is not been fully sort of elucidated when you think about, do we have a gluten problem in our consumption? Certainly, we all think of now sort of the availability of gluten-free offerings, celiac disease and gluten intolerances. I don't know if we know enough yet to say that everyone who's having an inflammatory issue is truly a question of gluten. I think more and more evidence is suggesting that it's a wider issue, right? The pesticide residues that exist within, in sort of our broader wheat system. I know this is anecdotal, but I know I'm not alone, and because I've heard it in 1,000 different podcasts and 1,000 different conversations. Like, how come when I go to Europe, I can eat pasta and bread and I never feel bad, and when I come back, it's not a gluten issue, at least not for everyone. And so for us, at Daily Harvest, we are 100% gluten-free, but we're a big believer in grains. We're a big believer in many grains that provide you the fiber and the carbohydrate profiles you need, again, organically grown to avoid the sort of pesticide issue. There are absolutely real gluten intolerances, but I think what we're dealing with is for the most part primarily an issue of pesticide.
Yeah, I agree. When we test all of our patients extensively here at my clinic, Next Health, and we're quite frequently encountering people with inflammation, either on blood panels or just in symptoms of inflammation, bloating, diarrhea, et cetera. And so we test people for gluten sensitivity. We have a very extensive gluten sensitivity panel. And then we recently have the ability now in the last year or two to test people for glyphosate exposure. Wow. And universally, the people that have a gluten sensitivity, a severe gluten sensitivity, have high levels of glyphosate as well. And so even though there's no research that has tied the two together that I'm aware of, we see it very frequently in our clinic, glyphosate being a massive contributor or at least associated to gluten.
Well, and this is one of the things I love that Dr. Casey talks about all the time is like, we don't necessarily need 30-year medical studies to make decisions. Right. When the evidence is clear, or when there's enough brilliant folks making connections like this, we should act. We should be more preventative. We should be more risk averse, quite frankly. And so I think this is a big push right now. In sort of how do we overhaul some of the agencies within government today to just be a little bit more action oriented and to say, maybe we again don't have that 30-year study that isolates this and every issue and proves it. I mean, this red dye story we were talking about earlier is a great example of that. There was enough evidence that it was cancer, it was connected to cancer, and yet it took another 30 years to get it out of the food system. So here's a great example. I mean, we're not going to get rid of chemical pesticides tomorrow. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen. But if we agree that we need to, we will start to make the right decisions to get our system back to a healthier place. Right.
I'm fully agreed. And also with chemicals that are not necessary in food, things like red dyes and yellow dyes, there's hundreds of dyes. Like, they're not necessary. There's other natural ways to add colors to food. And so maybe a look at eliminating some of these additives that we've allowed to be in our food system.
If you really think about all the foods that we're putting these dyes into it, and dyes is just one example. I would challenge us to look at, are those foods necessary?
Exactly. Exactly. There's a lot we can learn from our neighbors across the ocean in Europe. First of all, I think glyphosate is illegal in most countries. Secondly, they have a different type of wheat. They don't use the dwarf wheat, I think, and so there's a lot of talk about not having genetically modified crops as well. So, it's opposite. They do have a different dwarf type of wheat than we do. So some looking at genetically modified crops as well, and how does that change the protein structure of these plants, and how does that impact our gut? And thirdly, also, you go to a supermarket in Europe, and there's a very small section of packaged goods that is probably, hidden in a corner of most of these supermarkets. And it's a very different way of thinking about how we buy our food as well. And so, I think in the United States, we're used to walking to a massive supermarket with a ton of different options of foods, and you walk down each aisle like a rodent in a maze trap, just looking at everything there and picking different products based on marketing versus food quality.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about, this recommendation of, ideally shop the perimeter of the store, right? Like we're putting it on the individual. They have to actively avoid. I talk about it all the time. What's also really interesting about in Europe, there's been an understanding of the power of frozen, way more widely adopted than what we have here. This idea that frozen is actually fresh, right? It's locked in at that moment. And I've had some of my greatest experiences with the frozen fruit in Europe when you open the product and you see the ingredients. I think, we have a very similar aesthetic and experience. When you open our food, you'll see the ingredients. I tell people when they're asking, like, what is different about Daily Harvest? Our food is, in the case of our meals, it's frozen food that you cook. And, we've done the hard work of, delivering these delicious, incredible sauces in our meals that make that cooking experience there. But you see the individual Brussels sprout or the pepper or the tomato. It's not this sort of historical, U.S.-based frozen food where it's like cooked food, refrozen in a puck. And I make the comparison to Europe because I think when you go there and you look at what they have in the freezer aisle, it's some of the best quality food around. And so between that, to your point, a much greater focus on fresh produce and a much smaller focus on sort of packaged, shelf-stable foods, and much more of a purchase and eat mentality versus stocking up for a month. You see
Costco.
You see a very different output.
Right, I agree. And Costco, to be fair, they actually do have a lot of great
incredible
frozen
offerings,
right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. But the stocking up mentality also.
Yeah.
I always tell a lot of my patients, like, I ask them, do you have a pantry? And I say, if you have a pantry, turn it into a wine cellar. That might be a little bit healthier for you than having a pantry, right? Because people love going to massive supermarkets that sell and buy massive amount of packaged foods that are processed.
And look, as someone who, will always find myself snacking if snacks exist, the easiest way to stop snacking is for me not to have them,
right?
And so it's a big part of my strategy.
I love that. So let's bring it home for the average consumer. Okay, so if you're going to kind of change some of your food choices to kind of steer yourself towards a healthier pattern of eating, it sounds like what you're saying is try to find foods that are organic, if regenerative, even better. If they're frozen, that's going to be even better. So organic, regenerative food that's been frozen and kept in that state until it's delivered to you, then you take it and you cook it and you redevelop the relationship with food.
Yeah, I think, I would say, and I fully recognize that, it's not as easy for most to make these decisions every day. Food has gotten more expensive everywhere. But, I think we treat these decisions often in people's sort of relationship with food as like a 0 or 1. My biggest push is, change one meal, right? Start there. Right? How do you get yourself one meal a day where it's really foundationally built on organic fruits and vegetables? And, if you're someone who says, I don't know how I could possibly eat less meat, again, start with 1 or 2 less meals a week. I for a year, as kind of a thought experiment and a challenge to myself, said, what if I only was allowed to eat meat 100 times for the year? And it was kind of a totally random challenge I gave myself as a resolution. But what was fascinating, and I tracked it, and I forced myself to track it. What I found myself was I was prioritizing higher quality, right, and special moments for that meat consumption. And so, sometimes it's about small changes that sort of snowball into larger changes. And the other bit of advice I would share, and this has been a journey for me, as a person, right, I've certainly don't make all the healthiest choices all the time. Really pay attention to how you feel after you eat. I mean, there's so many great advances in science. I mean, you all support so many of them where you actually can collect data about how you're metabolically reacting to food, which I think is even better. But even before that, just recognize how you feel after you had a lunch. How do you feel at 3 p.m.? Right? Are you craving that coffee because you got to get going? Think about how you feel. Connecting sort of the physical and emotional connection to what we eat, I think is probably the fastest way we could drive change.
Yeah, spoken like a true chef.
It's true. It's true.
It's so true. It is so true. And then how can we all be a part of a change in the system so that we see actions like red dye being eliminated happening more quickly and more often? How can we help changing the system?
Yeah, I think we sort of danced around it a little bit earlier, but I'm a big believer that the sort of way our government has been built the last 60 years has prioritized less and less engagement from sort of the everyday individual. We sort of think about the political system through the lens of elections every 4 years, or maybe if you're slightly more engaged, every 2 years. I can't stress enough that elected officials work for you. They should be held accountable to make changes, and the only time they do is when they hear from us. And so whether you're getting active in an organization that is advocating for these changes or you're calling on your own, I think so much change can come from when we advocate for ourselves. And so I know we're trying to think, particularly now with sort of the acceleration of these conversations, the sort of Make America Healthy movement has really broken through. How do we make sure that we offer our customers and our sort of ecosystem a way to be directly engaged in the conversation? Because change is going to take a lot of commitment. And one thing we haven't seen consistently from our government is a commitment to change. Yeah. So we're going to have to push.
Right. I agree. And I think you're right. We are at a moment in time where I think change is going to be possible. And so the sooner that we can kind of all come together, listeners of this podcast, other podcasts, to make some of this change kind of stay in the forefront of our politicians' mentality, I think the better.
Yeah. And maybe the last thing I'll say is, and in doing so, it's okay to recognize that the answers to these problems are not all easy, right? And I think, we all want easy, quick wins. They won't all be, but I really think we're in a moment now where people are starting to understand just how critical changing the food system is. And I think we're on the precipice of real change.
Yeah. I think one other way I think about making real change is constantly talking to my kids about this.
Yeah.
Do you have children?
We don't.
Yeah. I have a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they
highly influential,
very highly influenceable right now. And so we're constantly talking about it. And, it's part of their brain now.
Yeah.
They understand that there's certain food that is in packaging that is only a treat. It's not supposed to be part of their everyday consumption. And the value of eating more fruits and vegetables and really looking for organic. And we take them to the farmer's market. And, the stuff at the farmer's market is expensive. But then when you look at what we're paying at the supermarket, it's really not that much more anymore. Yeah. And so we make it an activity, and I think also fostering a connection to food with your children is so important.
100%. And I think doing it at an early age, getting people excited about the cooking process, getting people to a farm, you bringing children into those moments where they can, get their hands in the soil, or we talk about getting your hands dirty. I mean, building that connection early on is so critical, and that's the next generation that's going to be fighting for change inevitably, because it will still be needed. But hopefully we get a good head start, and then they can finish the job for us.
Yeah, it's so important, because I think, I know my upbringing was really heavily focused around how do we make eating as easy and as quick and as cheap as possible.
Right.
Microwave dinners were invented in my generation, toastable frozen waffles, boxes of cereal to make breakfast literally take 5 seconds.
Yeah.
All of that came about as I was growing up. And so we lost a couple of generations there in the conversation of healthy eating, but I think bringing it back at this moment is critical.
I love that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on the show and helping me really kind of sort through my thoughts on this. It's so good to hear from an industry insider.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, take care. And how do people find you and learn more about Daily Harvest?
Yeah, you can go to dailyharvest.com to learn more. And we've also just started expanding into grocery stores. So you can find our store locator on our site. We're starting to make sure we're more widely available, which I think is critical. We built the business online, but only about 15% of consumers want to purchase food there. So it's time to go meet the rest of the consumers where they are.
I love it. And do you have any resources for people to learn more about organic and regenerative agriculture?
We have a lot on our website. You can go to our Theory of Change section on our website, which links to a lot of great resources. And we can leave some notes in the podcast. Yes. And if there's any follow-ups, I'm always available too.
That's fantastic. And then you mentioned a book, and I'd love to hear maybe your top 2 or 3 books to really, if you want to dive deeper into the food system.
There's a lot of newer books that continue to advance sort of the conversation. Maybe because I come from more of that chef and sort of food industry background. The Third Plate by Dan Barber I mentioned earlier, I think is a really foundational read. And then I would also encourage, I'm going to always forget the order, but it's either Sugar, Fat, Salt or Fat, Sugar, Salt. Again, I think if you really want to understand how in some cases what the industry was being asked to do, they delivered on and recognize that, it isn't all nefarious, but there's real reasons why we landed where we are. I consider those 2 really good foundational reads.
Yeah. And I'll add to that, our friend Casey Means' book,
yes.
Good Energy,
yeah,
is
please.
An excellent read about metabolic health and how the food system contributes to that. And my friend Dr. Mark Hyman's book, Food, What the Heck I Should Eat, is an excellent book about making good food choices. So that's
2 great additions.
Yeah, exactly. So, thank you so much for being on the show again, and look forward to our next conversation. Thank you.
Sounds good. Talk soon.